Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past week or so in reading. The first thing that I picked up this past week was Billy Bishop Goes to War, one of the most famous Canadian musicals. This is done by John MacLachlan Gray primarily, and was also created with the actor Eric Peterson, who I think most Canadians know from things like Street Legal and Corner Gas. The edition that I was reading was put together for the 30th anniversary of the play, which was a production that was done by the Soul Pepper Theatre, as it turns out, as a last-minute replacement. It goes into some interesting details about, and not just in the introduction, but then in the notes for the play itself, about the challenges in having the same actor playing Billy Bishop, who started this, obviously 30 years before. He was in his 30s the first time he played the role, and he was in his 60s when they did this anniversary play. So they adapted the script itself to have certain scenes that would play out differently if it's an older actor versus if it's a younger actor. So that was very interesting. This is not a play that I think reads particularly well because it's a musical. It isn't super compelling on the page. If I can find clips, I will link to some clips of a performance below so that you can take a look at it if you are not familiar with it. But I definitely thought the notes about the anniversary and the notes about the production changes were very interesting. Next up, I read John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven, which is fairly well known. This is the book that he wrote when he, I think, originally was going to write about a general history of the Mormon religion, and instead ended up writing about crimes committed by a pair of fundamentalist Mormon brothers. It does deal with some of the history of the religion's creation, which is interesting. It never felt completely cohesive to me, and I didn't feel like it had the grand nonfiction storytelling that something like Into Thin Air had. So I still thought it was very interesting because I genuinely knew almost nothing about the Latter-day Saints religion aside from the fact that they send their missionaries out all the time and they come and knock on your door on the weekend. But yeah, so it was definitely educational that way. I had never heard of these crimes that this was primarily about, so both of those things were interesting. I thought overall it wasn't as good a piece of writing as some of Krakauer's other books are. But again, it's hard for me to know because when I read Into Thin Air, I was on such a mountaineering kick at the time that I don't know if I'm remembering it in a completely objective way because I was so enthusiastic about that kind of thing at the time. Sorry, my dog is snoring. So after that, I read The Lost Child of Lichfurd by Paul Cornell. This is the second book in Cornell's Lichfurd series, which is one of his own projects. Paul Cornell, of course, does a lot of franchise writing. He's written Doctor Who tie-in novels. I think he's written some of the audio adventures I talk about all the time because he wrote one of my favorite superhero books of the past 15 years, Captain Britain and MI-13. So this book in particular has the same three witch characters, one of whom is actually an Anglican priest who can see the fairy world and can see magical happenings. And in this particular one, the priest starts seeing a ghost, and then other strange things start happening to the other two women, and they're going to once again be protecting their town from an invasion of otherworldly somethings. I thought what was really clever about this was that it used the fact that the one woman is a priest more. So it was not just a kind of exploration into neo-paganism, as I think more of the first book was, and this was more an exploration into how one would use a kind of Christian mythology in the same way, which I thought was really interesting. And I think Paul Cornell's wife is a priest herself, so I always wonder how much of that character is based on her. Anyway, I thought it was quite fun, and I'm looking forward to picking up the third book in this series. After that, I stuck with sort of British-themed series, and I picked up Her Nightly Embrace by Addie Tantimedh, who is also someone who writes a lot of comic books. This is the first volume in a series about a group of private investigators. The series is called the Ravi P.I. series because the main character's name is Ravi Singh. He is a guy who used to be a teacher, and after he got fired, he had a nervous breakdown, and he sees gods. Less is actually made of that than the summary would imply. I'm kind of two minds about this. I thought this was a lot of fun. It has an overarching character story, which I think is what makes it a novel as opposed to a collection of short stories, but it really plays out as several individual cases that this detective agency is working on, and each has its own introduction and conclusion as it moves along. I didn't think it was 100% successful. As you can tell by the actor on the cover, this is eventually going to be made into a TV series, but weirdly, it got the TV cover before the series has even started production. And this very much reads like he wrote up a series proposal and then fleshed it out a bit, because the stories themselves are a lot of fun, but there are a lot of points where I felt like I was being told things rather than shown them. There's one point where there are two characters who are the ex-cops in their agency, and they're going undercover in Amsterdam. And the main character makes an aside that one of them makes a joke that he would never make at home. And there's no way of knowing even what style of joke that would be, because we really aren't told anything about any of the other characters. So a lot of the asides like that fell flat for me because I didn't feel like we had enough backstory to feed into that. Now, in a TV show where you could have a lot more physical comedy and get a lot more information that way, I think that kind of thing could work. That said, this was very entertaining. I was going to say it's lots of running around London, but it's a lot of running around a variety of cities. And it plays on both spy stories and detective stories and general crime stories in a way that was a lot of fun. It's too fun to be gritty, but it's too gritty to be cozy, I guess is the way I would describe it. There are some things that I wonder if they're going to change for the TV series, because there are issues that are sort of introduced that are never played out, and I'm going to spoil something that I thought was a little odd. It's not a major piece, but if you don't want to know, just hit mute until I'm holding up a different book. So the main character ends up dating a woman who we find out early on is basically a rapist. She drugs a man and has sex with him repeatedly. It's commented on at the time, but for the rest of the story, nothing's made of that, and it's like, well, here's his charming relationship with his rapist girlfriend, but it's not mentioned. It is strangely glib, because I think a grittier story could play with that, and you could have a character in a relationship like that, and that could be an interesting thing to play with, but it's played for laughs in a way that I thought was really weird. I thought if you did that with a male character, it would be appalling. And I didn't feel quite as appalled, but I think that's just because of social stereotypes, because it's a woman, but considering the action, I should be appalled. I feel like in something that was a lot grittier, they could have dealt with that in an interesting way, and instead it was glib and weird. That said, this was still a lot of fun. I think the next book in this series actually came out this week, so I'm going to look forward to picking that up. So after that, I read volumes 2 and 3 of Giant Days. Giant Days is a slice of life book about 3 girls who are in their first year of university and having their day-to-day adventures, which with some slight exaggerations beyond the level of realism, but still with the sort of spirit of realism. I thought volume 1 was really charming, but volumes 2 and 3 I found were a little bit more uneven. I still enjoyed them, and I'm still going to read the next volume, because I think it's up to 5 now. But again, if I were paying for it, I think I probably wouldn't be. The series is written by Allison, and the illustrator actually changes in the midpoint of the second book, and I didn't find that as distracting as I thought it was going to be. It was actually, it flowed, it kept a lot of the same tone, so I thought that was pretty impressive. But as I said, it was fine, but a little bit disappointing because I had thought the first one was kind of lovely. And then finally, I read Fingers Elegy for a Disease, a personal and cultural history of polio. This is in part a memoir of Fingers' life and how she feels that polio impacted her life in terms of her family relationships and in terms of the broader social picture. For example, she talks about when, as a teenager, her sisters were all able to get jobs at a candy factory, but she wasn't, and they explicitly told her it was because she used crutches, and interesting stuff like that. She does talk a lot about the disability-related discrimination that she was facing. She talks a bit about the social impact of diseases in general. She lived in San Francisco for a period in the 80s and knew a lot of people who died from AIDS at the time. And she talks about how her son kind of grew up thinking that, well, everyone goes to multiple funerals on weekends. She talks a bit about things like the plague. She talks a bit about how people develop and identity as a disabled person and as kind of the social model of disability became more accepted in certain circles and so on. The main issue that I had with this is that none of the pieces really came together well. I thought the social history bits were very interesting, but they never really merged properly with her own memoir. And I think in part that was because whenever she didn't remember something, she would do a sort of meandering discussion about the fact that she didn't remember it, where she'd talk about this might have happened, or that could have happened, or do I not remember it because this, because that. And I think in a straight memoir, that would have been more compelling, but because it's mixing that social history with her personal history, it was too much of a tone shift. It was one of these things where it was too much of a jarring contrast to have the just the facts bit of the social history and the really vague musings on how memory can fail you personal bit. I was still quite glad that I read this because I talked about her short story collection, Call Me Ahab, last month, and I quite like her writing, and I think she was writing a number of things around the topic of the social model of disability in culture and in fiction at a point when it was all much newer than it is now. And so I appreciate it knowing more of her backstory, but I thought it could have been written more compellingly, or it could have had more of a focus on either the memoir element or the social history element, as opposed to this, which was a bit too much of not choosing a side. But still, it was worth reading. So that was my week. I hope you all had a good week. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody's Friday reads. I apologize for my dog snoring through all of this. I probably should have gone back downstairs to shoot this video. That's it for now. Ciao.